Right now, at this very moment, there are American aircraft carrier strike groups patrolling 3 different oceans. Hundreds of military bases dot the globe across 80 countries. Satellites built by the United States Department of Defense are tracking movement in places most people couldn't find on a map. The United States Air Force alone fields more combat aircraft than the next several nations combined. And beneath the surface of every major sea, American nuclear submarines move in total silence, armed, ready, and waiting. This didn't happen by accident, it didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't inevitable. The story of how the United States became the most powerful military force in human history is a story about hard decisions, national trauma, industrial genius, and a series of moments where America had to choose, again and again, between looking inward and stepping forward onto the world stage. This is that story. If you want the real history behind the world's most powerful military, no spin, no fluff, just deep analysis, subscribe to Military Insider right now. Hit the bell so you never miss an episode. This is the kind of content you won't find anywhere else. November 11, 1918, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. After 4 years of industrialized slaughter that killed nearly 20 million people, the Great War was over. And the United States, which had only entered the conflict in April of 1917, emerged from it in a paradoxical position, victorious but deeply reluctant. American troops had tipped the balance on the Western Front. The arrival of fresh, well-supplied U.S. forces had broken the stalemate that had bled Europe dry for years. Yet back home, the appetite for global involvement evaporated almost immediately. When President Woodrow Wilson returned from Versailles with his vision of a League of Nations, the U.S. Senate rejected it. America turned its back on the world it had just helped save. The military drawdown that followed was swift and severe. By 1920, the United States Army, which had surged to nearly 4 million men during the war, had collapsed to fewer than 200,000. Defense budgets were slashed. Weapons programs were canceled. The Navy, which Wilson had built into a genuine global force, watched funding dry up. The prevailing mood in Washington and across the country was clear. Europe's problems were Europe's problems. But underneath that isolationist surface, something important was quietly taking root. The war had exposed the extraordinary productive capacity of American industry. Factories that had been converted to build artillery shells, aircraft engines, and military vehicles had demonstrated something that strategists were beginning to understand, that in a modern industrial war, it wasn't just armies that won, it was economies. A small but influential circle of military thinkers, industrialists, and planners began asking a question that would define the next 2 decades. What would happen if America ever chose to fully mobilize? The answer would change the world. That question sat unanswered through most of the 1920s and into the 1930s, a decade defined by economic collapse, political isolationism, and a military establishment that was, by any honest measure, a second-rate force. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than Portugal's. Then the world caught fire. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something that much of the American public was not yet ready to accept, that this war would not stay contained. While Congress and the country debated neutrality, Roosevelt began laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most consequential industrial decisions in modern history. In a fireside address in December 1940, he put it plainly: the United States must become the great arsenal of democracy. The words were deliberate. The strategy behind them was already in motion. Even before Pearl Harbor forced America's hand on December 7, 1941, the Lend-Lease program had begun funneling weapons, aircraft, and supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union. American shipyards were expanding. The draft had been reinstated. The machinery of mobilization was being assembled piece by piece. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor, and every restraint came off. What followed was arguably the most extraordinary industrial transformation any nation has ever undertaken. Automobile plants retooled virtually overnight to produce tanks and bombers. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run facility in Michigan was rolling out a complete B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour by 1944. Shipyards on both coasts launched vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 8.5 million military rifles. The numbers are almost difficult to process. The Navy that had been neglected since Wilson's era became the largest and most powerful maritime force ever assembled. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy operated over 6,700 vessels, including more than 24 fleet carriers that had fundamentally rewritten the rules of naval warfare. Air power, once a fringe theory championed by visionaries like Billy Mitchell, had become central to military doctrine. The Army Air Corps, redesignated the Army Air Forces, grew from fewer than 300,000 personnel in 1941 to 2.4 million by the war's end. And then there was the weapon that changed everything. The Manhattan Project, launched in secrecy and executed across facilities from Los Alamos to Oak Ridge, produced what no other nation on Earth possessed: an atomic bomb. When the Enola Gay released its payload over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, it didn't just end the war. It announced, in the most absolute terms possible, the arrival of a new kind of power. When the fighting stopped in September 1945, the United States stood alone at the top. Its military was unmatched. Its economy was intact while Europe and Asia lay in ruins, and it held a nuclear monopoly that no other nation could yet challenge. That monopoly, however, would not last. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in August 1949. The American monopoly was over in 4 years. What followed was not a conventional arms race. It was something far more complex, a decades-long contest of ideology, technology, geography, and nerve that would shape every major military decision the United States made for the next 4 decades. The Cold War had begun, and America's entire approach to national security would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. The first structural response came quickly. In 1949, the United States helped forge the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, binding Western Europe and North America into a collective defense framework that had no precedent in American history. For a nation that had spent much of its existence avoiding permanent foreign alliances, it was a fundamental break from the past. Bases were established across Western Europe. American soldiers, aircraft, and armor were now stationed on foreign soil, not as an expeditionary force, but as a permanent presence. The logic was straightforward: deterrence. The Soviet Union would not move west if moving west meant war with the United States. But deterrence required credibility, and credibility required weapons. The nuclear arsenal expanded at a pace that seems staggering in retrospect. Hydrogen bombs replaced the relatively crude fission devices of 1945. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were developed, tested, and deployed. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction, MAD, an acronym that was entirely intentional, became the foundational principle of superpower relations. Both sides now held the capacity to destroy civilization. The logic was grim but functional. If launching a first strike guaranteed your own annihilation, neither side would launch. It held, barely at times. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than the public understood at the time, but it held. While the nuclear standoff defined the strategic ceiling, the competition played out across every other domain. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address of January 1961, gave the world a phrase it would never forget: the military-industrial complex. The permanent marriage of defense contractors, the Pentagon, and congressional appropriations had created a self-sustaining engine of military development. Research and development budgets funded technologies that spilled into civilian life, while continuously pushing the boundaries of what American weapons could do. The space race was, at its core, a military competition. Rocket technology that could place a satellite in orbit could place a warhead anywhere on Earth. When the United States landed men on the moon in 1969, it was a scientific triumph and a geopolitical statement delivered to every nation watching. American military bases now encircled the Soviet Union. The U.S. Sixth Fleet patrolled the Mediterranean. The Seventh Fleet anchored American power in the Pacific. By the 1980s, under the Reagan administration's dramatic defense buildup, military spending reached levels the Soviet economy simply could not match. The strain proved fatal. In December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The United States was now something the modern world had never quite seen: a unipolar power, with no peer competitor and the most advanced military on Earth. The question now was what to do with it. The answer came on the morning of September 11, 2001. The attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans on home soil did not expose a weak military. They exposed a new kind of threat, one that didn't wear a uniform, hold territory, or field a conventional army. The most powerful military in the world had to relearn how to fight. Within weeks, U.S. forces were in Afghanistan. Within 2 years, Iraq. The wars that followed were long, costly, and complicated, and they forced a transformation in how American military power was organized, deployed, and applied at the ground level. But while those wars were being fought, something else was happening in the laboratories, shipyards, and classified development programs of the American defense establishment. The next generation of military capability was being built. Stealth technology, first demonstrated operationally during the Gulf War in 1991, continued to advance. The F-35 Lightning II, the most expensive weapons program in human history, at over $1.7 trillion in projected lifetime cost, entered service across the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, giving all three branches a fifth-generation, low-observable combat aircraft. The B-21 Raider, a next-generation stealth bomber developed in near-total secrecy, has since entered production, designed to penetrate air defense systems that no other aircraft on Earth could survive. At sea, the United States operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike groups. No other nation operates more than 2. Each carrier strike group is itself a mobile military base, a floating ecosystem of destroyers, submarines, supply ships, and dozens of aircraft, capable of projecting lethal force anywhere on the planet within days. The domains of warfare have expanded well beyond land, sea, and air. The United States Cyber Command, established in 2009 and elevated to a unified combatant command in 2018, operates in the digital battle space around the clock. Offensive and defensive cyber capabilities are now central to military strategy. The ability to disable an adversary's power grid, financial system, or communications infrastructure without firing a single conventional shot represents a new frontier in warfare. Artificial intelligence is being integrated across the force at a pace that is accelerating annually. Autonomous systems, predictive logistics, AI-assisted targeting, and machine learning platforms are moving from experimental programs into operational deployment. The Pentagon's budget for AI-related defense programs has grown sharply each fiscal year, and the competition with China in this domain is now openly acknowledged as the defining military technological rivalry of the coming decades. The United States currently spends more on defense than the next 10 nations combined, a figure that reflects not just firepower, but the unmatched global logistics network, intelligence infrastructure, and alliance system that sustains American military reach on every continent. From a 200,000-man army ranked below Portugal, to a force that operates in space, cyberspace, and every ocean simultaneously, the journey took a century of sacrifice, ingenuity, and deliberate national will. The Titan was not born, it was built. And in a world growing more contested by the year, the question facing the next generation is no longer how this power was assembled, but whether it will be enough.